morning. If you're watching this, this is World History 2, Unit 12, right? 12? Unit 12, we're talking about World War II and genocide today. Before we get started on the lesson, a couple housekeeping things. First of all, Nationalism Project is due in 2 weeks. Okay? Due in 2 weeks. Remember, if you are a senior or junior, you're here all 4 days from here on out the rest of the semester. Freshman, sophomore should come back 4 days a week starting on the 23rd. Make sure you're getting all your work done. There's quite a few of you that are already failing because of missing work. Make sure you get that done. I offer tutoring Tuesdays and Thursdays. I can do in-person or virtual from 3:30 to 6, 6:30, something like that. If you want to stay for tutoring, let me know. I'll put you on the list. Yeah, that's all I got. So let's get started with World War II. First of all, let's talk about these guys up here. Okay? We have 2 sets of people, and I'm going to move this camera slightly so I have a little more wandering room. Okay, got 2 sets of people here. Good guys and the devil we know. Bad guys. Okay? The U.S., England, and the Soviet Union were the Allied powers. The Nazis, Italy, and Japan were the Axis powers. Okay? We talked about some of these guys last week. Who's this one? Hitler. He's got the swastika on his sleeve. Hitler. This guy. He's the Italian we talked about last week. Mussolini. Okay, Mussolini. This one. Military leader in Japan. Hirohito was the emperor. This guy was the military leader. Hideki Tojo. Alright, let's talk about the causes of World War II. I'm going to run through this slide quick because then we go into each cause a little bit more as we go. So there are a lot of economic and political causes, including war aggression by totalitarian powers. That's Germany, Italy, Japan. That's what we talked about last week. You have nationalism. You have the failure of the Treaty of Versailles. You have the weakness of the League of Nations. You have appeasement. And you have tendencies towards isolationism and pacifism in Europe and the United States. Let's start with the nationalism, okay? Hitler and Mussolini both appealed to feelings of nationalism to gain support from the people in their country. Let me stop here a second, and I want to show you a video to explain how this works. And because any chance I get to show this video, I will take. Does it help if I cut the sound on? Alright. This is Inception. We have a video inside a video. Whether or not it pops up and works correctly on the video, I don't know. Okay, I want you to look at this and look at it in comparison to down here. Can you see the similarities between Nazi Germany and what George Lucas was doing with the Empire and then J.J. Abrams with the First Order? I'm telling you guys, watch the Star Wars movies. It shows you the rise of Nazi Germany like that. Plus, any chance I can use Star Wars in class, I'm going to take. There we go. Okay. So, feelings of nationalism. That Nazi Germany's better than other countries. Italy's better than other countries. Japan, we're stronger than other countries. They appeal to these feelings of making people feel like they are better than others. And that led to the war. We talked about the Treaty of Versailles in depth last week, so I'm not going to hit it as hard today. Just remember that it was a very harsh peace for the Germans. Okay, Germany took all the blame and had to pay reparations, and that led to the anger that led to Hitler taking power and World War II occurring. I think it was you with the example with the pit bull last week. Okay, remember, League of Nations had no way to enforce its decisions. It was all bark, no bite. It had no way to enforce what I was saying. It could stay here all day and say, hey, don't do that. Stop doing that. We're going to make you pay money. But they had no way to actually take the money. Okay? No way to enforce the decisions. Plus, it didn't have the United States. Okay, that would be like having an Avengers movie, but we're not going to put Captain America, Iron Man, or Thor in it. We're going to put Hawkeye and Black Widow against a whole bunch of aliens. A guy with a bow and arrow and a spy with some guns. And good luck. They're going to die. Okay? I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Black Widow. I love Hawkeye. They're not going to make it. Okay? You got to have the muscle behind it. The U.S. didn't join. League of Nations didn't have any muscle. Okay, how many of y'all gone to the store and you see a kid just completely losing it? Okay? And you feel bad for the parent. And finally you see the parent like give the kid a sucker or something just to shut him up long enough to get out of the store. Okay? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. That's what happens here. Hitler is this little kid, and Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, comes in and says, we're going to give you a little bit. But then you got to stop. We'll give you a little bit of what you want. But you got to stop. You can't go any farther. Hitler says, okay. So they give him the German parts of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain goes back to England. And he's like, peace in our time. I've got peace. I did great. And then Hitler invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay. Chamberlain was a doormat. Chamberlain, quite frankly, was an idiot. He had no idea what he was doing. And it backfires very, very heavily. So appeasement is satisfying demands in order to keep a peace. Appeasement doesn't work. Ever. So we have a few major events in the war, and there's some other stuff I'm going to talk about as we go through here. But here's the stuff in your notes. You got the German invasion of Poland, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and the atomic bombs. So, in 1938, the Germans signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. Okay? Basically, this is Hitler and Stalin agreeing, we're not going to attack each other. Okay? I'll handle my stuff, you handle your stuff, and we'll leave each other alone. And they agree they're each going to invade Poland and then divide it between the two of them. What this is called is blitzkrieg. Okay? The way the Germans invade is blitzkrieg, a lightning war. But what happens is, and this was genius, and I wanted out of frame, I'm sorry. Once again, not advocating that Hitler's a good guy, because he's not. He's evil, and he's burning in all hell. Plain and simple. I don't care what religion you are. There's no religion where Hitler's a good dude. Anyway, but the Germans had so much military genius until they didn't. Like, they did everything right until they didn't. And it starts with Poland. Because they sent small squads of Polish-speaking German soldiers into Poland. Because they knew there were little radio outposts along the border that had to radio in. All's quiet. No Germans. We're good. And they hit these radio outposts. So in Warsaw, radio's out, hey, what's going on? You haven't checked in. The German soldiers radio back in perfect Polish, everything's okay. Nothing's wrong. And then they take all of Poland. I think it took like a week. Okay, it did not take long for Poland to fall. And that's what Blitzkrieg is, what this lightning war is. Then they turn around and they take France. 6 weeks. Okay? And like we talked about last week, this is the German border, but the Germans invade through Belgium again. Same way they did in World War I. Did the exact same plan. And the French didn't learn. Only this time they don't get bogged down and they take Paris. Now let's talk about Dunkirk for a second, because Dunkirk's one of the really big things with World War II. One of my favorite stories of World War II. So the Allied soldiers, the British and the French, were trapped right here on the beach. I mean, they had nothing but water in front of them, and they had millions of German soldiers behind them. The Germans could have wiped them out like that, but they didn't. Instead, they decided to toy with them. They would drop leaflets into the city saying, we have you surrounded. You better surrender or we're going to kill every single one of you. And what ends up happening is the call goes out in England. And normal people get on their boats, sail across the English Channel to evacuate these soldiers and save the Allies to live to fight another day. There's a movie about it by Christopher Nolan called Dunkirk. Came out a few years ago. I want to say 2017 maybe. Not a great movie, but the scene of the civilian armada arriving to evacuate these soldiers, I mean, that tugs at your heartstrings. And after this, Winston Churchill gives one of the most famous speeches ever. And it goes along the lines of, we will fight in the streets, we will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the hills, we will never surrender. So, and it broadcast worldwide. And basically this is Churchill giving a giant middle finger to Hitler saying, bring it. We're not giving up. Bring it. Because at this point, Hitler's taken all of Europe except for England. And England's standing alone because the U.S. isn't part of the war at this point. So, Hitler obliges. So they take France, June 22nd, 1940. August 1940, Hitler begins almost a year-long campaign of just bombing Britain, day in, day out, morning, noon, night, for almost a year. I mean, London is bombed into oblivion. There's a Brad Pitt movie. I think it was Brad Pitt. Maybe it was Ben Affleck. I don't know. It was one of those pretty boy actors. Called Allied. And it shows a great scene of the Blitz. That's what this was called when Britain was being bombed. It was called the Blitz. And it shows, his wife was pregnant and in labor. They were getting ready, she was having a kid, and they had to wheel her out of the hospital because it was getting bombed. And they had to wheel her through the streets of London on a stretcher while she's in labor, and there's bombs going off everywhere. And this wasn't made up for a movie. This actually happened, and happened all the time. The people of London had to live in the underground, live in the subway system, because it was the only safe place left. But every single day of the Blitz, Churchill would go out and walk the streets in his nice suit with his little bowler hat, with a cigar in his hand, saying, I'm still here. We're going to stand and fight. And they did. Outside the range of the German bombers, they built up the Royal Air Force, the RAF, and then took the fight to the Germans. And the Germans proved a failure because the RAF was able to go back into the northern part of the UK, refuel, retool, come back and take it to the Germans again. The Germans had to retreat, had to pull back into Europe. And this was Hitler's first defeat. So Hitler was heavily, heavily embarrassed by the Battle of Britain. And it's my belief that if Hitler had won the Battle of Britain, he wouldn't have made his next mistake. Because he made his next mistake because of the embarrassment of the Battle of Britain. Does that make sense? It's like if you get him, let's say, you watch a basketball game, okay? LeBron James. Let's say someone blocks LeBron. I mean, just stuffs his shot, ball comes back, hits him in the face. I mean, it is terrible or hilarious. I'm not a huge LeBron fan, so I would think it was hilarious. Next time LeBron gets the ball, he's going to go after that same guy and try to dunk on him. Does that make sense? Just to prove, hey, I still got it. And that's what Hitler does. He doesn't go after Britain. He takes on the Soviet Union. The only guy Hitler was afraid of up to this point was Stalin. And because he lost the Battle of Britain, Hitler had to save his image. So he turns around. I mean, this is like, I don't know. Let's say there's a lion, okay? We're in Africa at this point. A lion gets kicked in the face by a zebra. Okay? So this lion's embarrassed. So in turn, he's going to go attack a crocodile. It makes no sense. But he does it anyway. And I mean, he just gets embarrassed in the Soviet Union. And what happens and what I don't understand, and sorry virtual kids, I'm out of frame for a second. Here's Moscow, the capital. Okay? Stalin didn't expect this. It was a surprise. So the Nazis basically walk right into Moscow. Take the capital. Force a surrender. But instead, they turn the entire army to go after this one city down here in the southern Soviet Union. Yes, they had some oil, but there wasn't that much. The problem is, Hitler and Stalin had such big egos that Hitler didn't take Moscow. He didn't end the war because he wanted to take a city that had Stalin's name in it. As a middle finger to Stalin. That's it. That was a mistake. If he had taken Moscow, he could have taken out the Soviet Union. But instead, he let his ego get the best of him. So they walk into Stalingrad, surround the city. This city is under siege for months. And then the winter hits. And what have we learned about armies that attack Russia and get stuck in the Russian winter? Bad things happen. So the Germans are freezing to death, and Stalin walks his troops right to Stalingrad. He brings the winterized troops, the ones that are born in Siberia. I mean, it's like these winterized Soviet troops and then polar bears. Okay? I mean, they're ready to fight in the cold, in these elements. Walks them in and wipes the Germans out. All because Hitler wanted to take the city that had Stalin's name in it. And that was so far as the Germans got in Russia. Because then the Soviets just start walking them back, until 1945, April 6th, where the Americans and the Soviets meet in the middle of Berlin. This was the beginning of the end for Hitler, was Stalingrad. So let's flip it. Pearl Harbor. The United States tried to stop the Japanese war machine. Okay? Tried to stop it by cutting off the oil. Because we were selling the Japanese oil. We were fueling the Japanese empire. So we cut the oil off. Well, that made the Japanese angry. So they attacked Pearl Harbor. December 6th, 1941. I mean, it was just out of the blue. A lot of people say, well, the Americans knew. Maybe we had an inkling, but we didn't have enough actionable intelligence to act on. Does that make sense? It would be like me saying, oh, by the way, we're going to get attacked. Ain't nobody going to listen to me. It's not like they have a stack of paper this tall saying, hey, we're going to get attacked. So they didn't act on it. Does that make sense? So they attacked the fleet at Pearl Harbor. Most of our Pacific fleet is either destroyed or severely, severely limited. What happened in 1942 is the Battle of Midway. Let's see, is that on here? Okay. So we declare war on Japan on December 7th. Japan, of course, declares war on us. We're at war with Japan. Germany did not have to do anything. Okay? We were not looking at the Germans here. It was us and Japan. Okay? We're over here. Us and Japan are getting ready to fight. And then from the other side of the world, Hitler goes, hey, I'm declaring war on America too. If you just sit down and shut up. We weren't worried about Germany. But the second Hitler declares war on us, we're fighting two wars. That makes sense? A lot of these missteps Hitler made because of his ego. Okay? So, what happens... Okay, that's D-Day. A couple things before we get to D-Day. 1942 Battle of Midway. We break the Japanese code. We know where they're going to be. We have 3 aircraft carriers left and like a handful of destroyers. Not much. So we go to Midway. We know we're probably going to lose Midway, but we have to take the fight to the Japanese. Battle starts. Shortly after, FDR gets a call they're like in the Situation Room, or that equivalent. And the Secretary of the Navy picks up the phone and reports back to President Roosevelt. 4 carriers are sunk. Roosevelt looks at him and he goes, we only have 3. Yes, sir. 4 Japanese carriers are sunk. We wiped the floor with the Japanese at Midway. They didn't see us coming. Because like the islands are right here, we were behind the islands to where they masked us on radar. They couldn't see our ships until it was too late. By that point, it was the same thing. Like how Stalingrad, it was the Germans starting to get walked back. Same thing here. Once we won Midway, that was the turning point in the Pacific. And we started to walk the Japanese back by island hopping. And what that means is we would take them one island at a time. We'd surround the island, take the island, and then use that island to take the next island. And then the next one. And the next one. Does that make sense? Until we were bombing Tokyo. But we'll get to that in a minute. In Europe, we invade Sicily, Italy, 1943. General Patton was one of the main guys there. Now, at this time period, they didn't know what PTSD was. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. But we do now. And basically, it's something, I don't want to say break, because they're not broken. But something just happens. And it makes a soldier get stuck. Does that make sense? Like I had a friend, I worked with a subway back in high school. Her husband was in Iraq. And if like a car backfired or something, it would trigger his PTSD And he'd be driving down the road one second, and then back in Iraq the next. And it was just that quick. And it doesn't have to be war. There's a lot of different things that can trigger PTSD, but for this example, I'm focusing on war. World War II, this was known as being shell-shocked. Okay? They didn't realize, hey, it's this severe thing. They're stuck. We need to snap them out of it. So Patton's talking to this shell-shocked soldier. That's a tongue twister. And the soldier's like, sir, I can't go on. I can't do it. I can't get back in the fight. Patton goes, son, you're getting back in the fight. Sir, I can't. You're getting back in the fight. The soldier starts crying because he physically cannot get back in the fight because of his PTSD. But they don't know it at the time. So Patton does what any good commanding officer would do. There's a lot of sarcasm in that statement because Patton was not a great commanding officer. He looks at the soldier and just backhands him. Says, fine. You can't fight, you're no good to me. And walks away. Well, word gets back to President Roosevelt that his top general in Europe at the time smacked a soldier. Patton gets yanked from duty. Brought back to the Americas. Brought back to the U.S. Says, you're not in the war anymore. You're done. Hitler didn't believe it. The American general Hitler thought highest of was Patton. He's like, no way. They didn't pull their best general out for smacking a soldier. That's a lie. It's not true. But we did. We start planning for this offensive, June 1944, D-Day. And we know that Hitler admires Patton. We have to use that to our advantage. So Patton gets put back in the field. Patton's given 100,000 men, 100 tanks, 1,000 planes, and said, you're invading France. You're taking Calais. They set up literally right across the English Channel in England where the Germans can see them. And they start gearing up to take Calais. Now, at this time, British soldiers start washing up on the beaches of France and the Nazis find them. And they just so happen to have the invasion plans in their pocket, saying, we're invading Calais. How many men did I say Patton had again? 100,000? Yeah, it was more like 1,000. How many tanks?
100.
Yeah, that didn't happen. Planes?
1,000.
Nope. Patton had 100 men. Set up enough tents for 100,000. The tanks were inflatables. The planes were plywood. From the air, it looked like Patton had this massive invasion force. He didn't have a thing. We didn't hit Calais. We hit Normandy. The British soldiers that washed up on the beach were corpses from the morgue in London. They dressed up in a uniform, put fake planes in, and dropped them out of an airplane. The Germans were so convinced we were going to hit Calais that on June 6th, 1944, we hit Normandy. D-Day. I mean, this is the greatest generation the Americans ever had. We will never have people, well, I don't want to say never. It is very, very rare that we will have as many brave souls as we did on this day. They knew what they were walking into. They were landing on a beach with hills. The Germans had machine guns on the hills aimed at the beach, and they walked right into it because they knew no one else would, and they had to. We took the beaches of Normandy. Us, the Brits, and the Canadians took Normandy. Got a foothold in Europe. And Hitler refused to send any kind of reinforcements because he was building up Calais. He was building the defenses at Calais because he said, Normandy's a distraction. Patton's coming. We were smart. Man, we were smart. Patton never showed. Patton never hit Calais. Until it was too late, Hitler never sent reinforcements. Eventually, Patton does show up and brings a tank brigade with him. And that's important at the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans start to turn the Allies, and then here comes Patton. And we win the Battle of the Bulge. June 6, 1944, we took Normandy. April 6th, was it April 6th? Sorry. April 1945, the Americans and the Soviets meet in Berlin. May 8th, 1945, the war is over in Europe. Now, can y'all tell I love World War II? This is where it gets good. World War II, the Cold War, this is where it gets good. D-Day was led by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Okay? D-Day, Dwight D. That's how you keep it. He was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Eisenhower starts with an E. Does that make sense? Let's talk about Japan. So we're aiming at Japan. April 1945, President Roosevelt has a stroke and dies. Harry S. Truman, the vice president, takes over. Harry Truman had only been vice president for about 3 months. He wasn't FDR's vice president the entire time. He was new. He became vice president in April, and then August, the military comes to him and says, here we go. We have 2 plans. We can invade Japan. Okay? That's option 1. We invade Japan. Option 2 is we have this new weapon. We can use it. A lot of people are going to die. A lot of civilians. But that's our other option. We don't have to invade. So Truman had to weigh the risks. If we invade Japan, 1 million people would die. Okay? That's Americans, Japanese, civilians, 1 million people. Or we use the atomic bombs. Truman went with the bomb. So, August 6th, 1945, we dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. And you can hear it said Hiroshima, Hiroshima, same thing. We dropped the first atomic bomb. Then we send a message to the Japanese. Surrender, or we'll do it again. Japanese said, no, we're not going to surrender. August 9th, we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. Japanese finally surrender September 2nd, 1945. We waited until we could get a ship we fixed from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo to accept surrender. We forced the Japanese emperor to step onto a ship that they had bombed to surrender. Basically saying, hey, look, we got you. You lose. You hit us with your best shot. You lose. The war is over September 2nd, 1945. In Japan and Europe. So then we have to start rebuilding. Major leaders. These are Americans. FDR was first. Okay, he was president for most of the war. After he dies, Truman takes over. Truman drops the bomb on Hiroshima. Make sense? Dwight D. Eisenhower was the commander in Europe for D-Day. Douglas MacArthur, see this capital A in the middle of his name? That's not how English usually does, right? There are no capital letters in the middle of words, for the most part. MacArthur there is. He was the commander in Asia, in Japan. Okay? George Marshall wrote the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program. We already talked about these four, so I'm not going to hit them again. Churchill was the British Prime Minister. Let me tell you two quick stories on Churchill. We're still okay on time. These are my two favorite stories of Churchill. Churchill was a great wartime leader, not a great peacetime leader. Because Churchill didn't do well with people. A wife of one of the members of Parliament hosted a party one night. Churchill, being the Prime Minister, was invited. So, Churchill goes. Churchill's known to enjoy his scotch. Churchill gets drunk. There's no two ways around it. So, the wife hosting the party realizes, oh, the Prime Minister's drunk. We probably need to get him out of here. She goes up and says, Mr. Prime Minister, I think it's time for you to go. What? Sir, you're drunk. Churchill looks at this lady and goes, well, you're ugly. Mr. Prime Minister, why would you say that? Churchill goes, because in the morning, when I wake up, I'll no longer be drunk. In the morning, when you wake up, you're still going to be ugly. Turns around and leaves. Churchill did not care. Then my other story I like about Churchill is when he came to the United States to visit the president and plan, he would stay in the Lincoln bedroom. Okay? Named that because that's where President Lincoln stayed when he was alive. And at this time, there was no showers, no running water, so they would run a bath, and the bath was in the room. So one morning, Churchill takes his bath, gets out, he's air drying. I mean, he was a rather large man. Just standing there, butt naked, cigar in one hand, glass of scotch in the other, because like I said, Churchill liked his scotch. And this comes from Churchill. So the truth of it is, if Churchill believes it, it happened. And he says he was standing there and he heard something behind him. So he turned around. President Lincoln was standing there looking at him. At this point, President Lincoln had been dead 80 years. At least. He looks at the president. Lincoln looks back at him. Churchill goes, he looks down, realizes he's still naked, looks at President Lincoln and goes, well, Mr. President, you have me at a disadvantage. He said Lincoln smiles, turns around, and disappears. And from that day forward, since he saw the ghost of Abe Lincoln while he was naked, Churchill slept in the basement of the White House. He wouldn't stay in the Lincoln bedroom anymore. So those are my two favorite Churchill stories. Have absolutely nothing to do with the lesson, but I like Churchill. Okay. And then we talked about Stalin, Hitler, Tojo, Hirohito. We're not hitting them again. So let's talk about genocide and the Holocaust. And this is where things get a whole lot less fun. Genocide is the systematic and purposeful destruction of a racial, political, religious, or cultural group. The Holocaust was caused through totalitarianism combined with nationalism. You had a history of anti-Semitism, which is a hatred of the Jews. They blamed the defeat of World War I and the economic troubles on the Jews. Hitler believes in a master race, blonde hair, blue-eyed, Aryan brotherhood. Hitler wasn't Aryan. He was an Austrian. He had dark hair and dark eyes. He didn't even fit his own master race. So they set up the final solution, which is extermination camps and gas chambers. Okay, they rounded up the Jewish people, not only the Jews, but they're the ones that the brunt of the Holocaust happened. Rounded them up, shipped them off to these death camps. If you were too young to work, or too old or sick to work, the second you walked through those gates, they sent you straight to either a firing wall where they lined you up and shot you, to a gas chamber, or they just straight sent you into the oven and burned you alive. We had a guy here a couple years ago. I don't know if he's still living. He might be. He was old, in his 90s. Doesn't live far from here. He was in the Holocaust. He's a survivor of the Holocaust. I cannot remember his name to save my life, but he was at Dachau. And Dachau was one of the extermination camps in the former Yugoslavia. He came and he talked about his experience. It was very, very powerful. But, I mean, these people were put through unmentionable torture. At Auschwitz, Joseph Mengele, I think was his name. He was the camp doctor there. And his thing was he liked to experiment on the Jews. He would his big thing was twins. He would cut the arm off one twin and stitch it on the other to see if it still worked. Or he'd remove organs and switch them out to see if they worked. Different things they would test on the Jews at the camps to use on German soldiers. They would slice open a Jew's arm, stuff it with dirt and grime so it would get infected, and test different antibiotics on it to use on German soldiers in the field. The different gas and chemical weapons, they practiced on the Jews. That's something you guys will just have to look into more on your own. I can't go into more detail. I mean, I could, but probably shouldn't. So outcomes of the war. We're going to kind of fly through this part because we're starting to run out of time. If the loss of empires by European powers, you have the establishment of two superpowers in the world, the U.S. and the Soviets. You have the Nuremberg trials, the division of Europe, the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. And we're going to hit each of these as we go. So the war crime trials were set up in Japan, Italy, and Germany. Germany was known as the Nuremberg trials. They were held to hold these Germans accountable for their actions. They can't just say, but I was only following orders. Sorry, that doesn't fly when you're exterminating people. The Iron Curtain divided Europe. Okay? It was symbolic. There wasn't actually an Iron Curtain going down to the middle of Europe. But it divided the Western Europe from Eastern Europe, from the communists from the democratic Europe. And this was described in 1946 in a speech by Churchill. United Nations was set up at the Yalta Conference. This was to keep the peace. NATO was made in 1949 to protect Western Europe from the Soviets. In 1955, the Soviets set up the Warsaw Pact to protect them from NATO. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was established and adopted by the United Nations, provided a code of conduct for the treatment of people under the protection of their government. This was set up to prevent the Holocaust from happening again. Did not work like that. In Germany, you have the Marshall Plan, setting up the United States sending in money to rebuild. West Berlin, West Germany becomes democratic. East Berlin becomes communist, East Germany. And we'll talk more about that next week. Japan was occupied by the United States. MacArthur was put in charge. They become democratic. Their economy becomes strong. Japan gives up their offensive military capabilities. The U.S. guarantees Japan's security. And that's how it is today. One of our biggest overseas bases is on Okinawa. Okay? We still protect Japan to this day. Okay, let's talk about these different genocides. The only one I'm going to mention right here, because we're going to go into them in a second, is Stalin. This is a political genocide. He went against anyone he deemed an enemy. These others, it's a little more cut and dry. So Armenia. The Ottoman government embarked on the systematic decimation of the Armenian people. The Armenians were largely Christian and were wiped out by the Ottoman Empire, who was largely Muslim. Okay? The Armenian population of the Ottoman state was about 2 million in 1917. By 1923, the entire Armenian population of Turkey was gone. Okay? They killed 1 million people in 3 years. Men, women, children, didn't matter. They wiped them out. There are entire cities that are no longer on the map. because they killed everyone and then burnt the city down, destroyed it. Pol Pot was the leader in Cambodia. He was the leader of Khmer Rouge. If you ever hear the phrase the killing fields of Cambodia, that's what this is talking about. He killed 25% of the country's population. So there's 8 people in this room, okay? Including me, there's 8 of us. This would be like me just killing 2 of you. Doesn't look like a lot right now, but that's a quarter of the room. Does that make sense? Artists, politicians, intellectuals, anyone Pol Pot deemed a threat, he had killed. Sent off into the fields where they worked until they dropped dead. Or, one of his soldiers just walked by and shot you in the back of the head and left your body there to rot. That's why it's called the killing fields. Just exterminated. This next one is the one that physically makes me sick. Okay? Rwanda. In Rwanda, Hutu extremists... Okay, let me rewind. Rwanda, when the Europeans left, they left the Tutsis in charge of the government. The Tutsis were the minority. There are 2 ethnic groups, Tutsis and Hutus. Literally, the only difference between these 2 groups of people, the Tutsis were a little taller, their noses were a little thinner. That's it. They looked a little more European, so the Europeans left them in charge. The Hutus hated them for it. So in the 90s, there was April 6, 1994. The president of Rwanda is killed in a plane crash. His plane's blown up. Okay? If I remember right, he was a Hutu. And the Hutus blamed the Tutsis for killing the president. So, a couple weeks after April 6th, almost 1 million people were killed. Men, women, children, did not matter. They saw them as cockroaches. That's what they called them. That's what the Hutus called the Tutsis, were cockroaches. It started by a broadcast going off on the radio saying, it's time to cut the tall trees. Remember, the Tutsis were a little taller, so they were the tall trees. It was a code to start wiping out the Tutsis. And they didn't do it by walking up and shooting them. The Hutu wiped out the Tutsis using machetes, farming tools. Very rarely were there guns involved. Last week I talked to you about the Nanking book. Remember that? Mm-hmm. This is the other one that was very hard for me to read. Machete Season. And this is an interview with 4 of the killers in this genocide. This lady goes to the prison and interviews them. One of them was very apologetic, very sorry about what he did. One of them was just like, I was following orders. 2 of them were like, we enjoyed it. This is why. Let's see. I wanted to read you one part right here. Okay. This is from, let me make sure I'm telling you right. Where's my little list of people? So I can tell you who I'm telling you about. Come on. I know you have it. No? Okay. I thought you told me who was who. Oh, here we go. Okay, the guy I'm about to read you, he was 50 years old when they started killing. Okay? And this is his words, the words of a killer in this. We were forbidden to choose among men and women, babies and oldsters. Everyone had to be slaughtered by the end. Time was hurrying us on. The job pulled us along, and the intimidators kept saying, anyone who lowers his machete because of somebody he knows, he is spoiling the willingness of his colleagues. If you refuse to kill someone, they killed you. Here's another one. Our Tutsi neighbors, we knew they were guilty of no misdoing, but we thought all Tutsis at fault for our constant troubles. We no longer looked at them one by one. We no longer stopped to recognize them as they had been, not even as colleagues. They had become a threat greater than all we had experienced together, more important than our way of seeing things in the community. That's how we reasoned and how we killed at the time. There's one more part that really showed you. Where was it? I need you guys to understand how bad this was. Where was it? Okay. If I can't find it, I'll just sum it up. Oh, here it is. So they surrounded the maternity hospital. Okay? Mothers and babies. They surrounded the maternity hospital. They ripped down the gates. They simply shot up the locks. They wore very handsome cartridge belts of highly polished leather, but they wanted to avoid wasting bullets. They killed the women with machetes and clubs. Whenever one of the more agile girls managed to escape the commotion and get out a window, she was caught in the gardens. When a mama had hidden a child underneath her, they picked her up first, then cut the child, then the mother. When they say cut, that means they killed him with a machete. They cut the nursing infants. That's genocide. That's just a tiny bit of what's in here. That's what this is. Okay? It's heartbreaking that they killed almost a million people because of not even the different color of their skin. Literally, their nose and their height. Genocide can be racial, ethnic, religious, political, or cultural. Another one that's not in your notes, but I've seen on the test before, is Bosnia. This is 1990s. So this is 94. This is 26 years ago. It's not the far past. Bosnia is the early 90s as well. And it's the same thing. It's Croats, Serbians, Bosnians. The Croats and the Serbs start killing the Bosnians. I mean, it's heartbreaking. That's all it is. It's heartbreaking. But any questions? I think Rwanda's the end. Okay. Any questions for me? All right. If you guys have any questions, leave a comment, shoot me an email, something like that. For this unit, you have notes, test review, vocab quiz will go live on Wednesday, your unit test. Make sure to get that stuff done for me, please.